Welcome to the New Generation Leader Podcast. We're giving you the tools you need to lead in the digital world. Ready to reach your true potential? This is the New Generation Leader Podcast.
Welcome to our Allyship Channel. This is Jim Lee. I'm Aaron Lee. We are here to have a conversation on building bridges and what allyship means in our 21st century world. Jim, give us a little bit of your background, your story. Who are you?
Yeah, so I was born in the mid-70s, 1970s, with my parents that came to the U.S. in the early 70s. And there's a lot of people that I know that kind of resonate with the story, and I thought it was kind of fascinating to be able to do this podcast together to kind of help those that might have felt alone in this journey that they're living in, because I felt alone. You know, I was one of like 3 Asians in my early elementary school class. And I remember like I wasn't Chinese, I wasn't Japanese, I'm Korean, but not a lot of people knew what Korean was. And then I had parents that like eventually owned a small business, but early on they came to the States and they couldn't get the same caliber type of jobs that they had, reflecting of their education in Korea. So my dad working at a warehouse for Volkswagen, distribution of their parts and supplies. And then my mom was working as a bank teller for Bank of America. And just a lot of the common things of just trying to figure out how to live life in America. I remember a lot of the struggles that they had. And reflecting back, I can see a lot more of the cultural differences that I had to kind of transition to when it comes to being a kid in America, and as well as just the impact that it had in terms of not only my career, but as well as the type of friends that I've had and the type of life that I've lived.
And at what point did you move to the States?
Oh, I came when I was like 100 days old. In fact, my parents were already married in the States. And then because of Korean tradition, the mom usually has her mom and her sister help them out in the early days of after postpartum, I guess. And so there's a rule that the first 100 days you stay at home, you don't go out. And so those were the 100 days that I spent in Korea when I was born. So my mom, right before her last trimester, went to Korea, had me, and then on the 100th day when they were allowed to leave is when I came to the States.
I grew up in a similar kind of community where I can only recall 2 Asian classmates. One was adopted by 2 Caucasian parents. The other was a good friend in my school. Carl went on to fight in the Marines in the Iraqi War and gave up his life defending the country. But those were, at that point in my childhood years, in terms of classmates, they were the only Asians I knew directly. There weren't other Asians in school. There weren't Asian families in our community, in our neighborhood. I didn't have a lot of that multicultural, intercultural experience or understanding until we had a Japanese college student spend the holiday winter break with us one year. Rather than flying all the way back to Japan for the break, she spent a couple weeks in our house, had Christmas cookies, spent the whole holiday with us. And that started to open our eyes because she became almost like a family member. And she would send us notes and cards and gifts periodically. A few years later, she and her husband got married, came to North America for their honeymoon, and she brought him by to meet us because she considered us part of her extended family. And we saw them again about 10 years later when their daughter was born. They came back on another trip. But even in all of those experiences, I don't think I truly understood the cross-cultural dynamics. And that's probably something, being from a family who had been at least in this region of the country for 3 or 4 generations, there wasn't a lot of need for me to pay attention to any other cultural dynamics because this was our family, going back generations. This was our community, our region. And so we just were.
I think it's interesting. I don't think we shared though, but like you're in the East Coast, right, in Virginia. And I grew up in Los Angeles. So a lot of people find it very interesting that there weren't other Koreans when I was growing up. And even just the Asian population was so small at the time. And if you look at the Los Angeles area today, I mean, it is quite large. You know, I don't know the statistics, shame on me, but I know where I live, which I moved out to more of a suburb. We're only 10% of the population out there. But even that is quite larger than like what I had. So my daughter just entered kindergarten this fall, and she didn't really have a lot of other Asian friends in preschool, but in her kindergarten class alone, there are 4 other Korean friends that she was actually able to meet for the first time. And I think it's interesting that like just how much of that culture is more even accepted, I think, today in those younger generations. But I think from what I'm experiencing, it's still not so much so today with the older generation, perhaps.
You know, it's interesting. I know your love for the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah.
For some reason, as many times as I've heard you say you grew up in Los Angeles, when you talk about growing up, I still picture in my mind, for some reason, Detroit. I don't know why. That's not even the same state as Green Bay, but for some reason, and so it's always interesting trying to reframe those stories, reframe those experiences, or reframe what we're picturing in our minds when we hear somebody from another background with another life experience relaying part of their own story.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. My best friend is actually from Detroit, and he's Korean American too. Very rare, you know, and we'll swap stories, but very similar, just because Asians were such a minority back then. And I think one of the differences that I would say he was better at than I did, which was more of a Western cultural reflection, was I think he had more of some of the, maybe it might be just more the Midwest hospitality type of culture that he was accustomed to, that it is not as much, you know, in the LA area, just in general comparison. But it was kind of interesting to see how much of just the Western culture and the different versions and the variety of Western culture that's out there, of how he brings that in to our relationship and our friendship as well.
Part of what this series is about is for us to dive into those stories. And I know for me, many of the stories that we hear from other people, or the stories we reflect on from ourselves and our own experience, they start to take on a slightly different, we bring a slightly different view to them at this point in our lives than we did in the moment.
Yeah.
And so we want to walk through those stories, both your experience and my experience, tell some of those stories, reflect on them, see how our story has changed throughout the years as we've gone through decades at a time. But then looking back, what have we learned? How has that changed our life perspective, our view on what's happening around us? And then also take a look at what would we do different, or how can we bring our kids along to have a more aware viewpoint in where they are and what they're seeing in a new generation.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful for us to take a moment and process through the things that we did maybe unconsciously. You know, I say there's a double blind spot that I've seen with, you know, like specifically Asian culture and those that are more of the traditional Western culture in America. And they both tend to intersect in the areas of unconscious behavior, where it's unconscious competency. Like they do things very well, because it's how they ought to do it and that's just natural for them, but also the areas that they tend to struggle in and not realize that that may be due to the areas where these two cultures are starting to intersect as well. And so, like, as we kind of go through in this podcast and reflect back, I think it's really powerful for me to not only reprocess some of the things that I've done, like understand why I had certain challenges and why do Asians continue to statistically have the challenge of getting promoted. That's a big one. And see, okay, if we were to rewind the tape and understand what are some of the things that we might do in our Asian culture very well, unconsciously, but realize it collides with Western culture in a way that isn't reflected in how we ought to be, that unconscious competency actually is an unconscious incompetency translated into Western culture for a way, and how I can be more intentional about how I not only lead myself, but also how I can make sure that my daughter doesn't learn some of these unconscious habits that I would just do because it was passed down to me. That doesn't necessarily, I think, accurately reflect the rich culture Asians have. So I'm not trying to say like I want to eliminate my Asian culture, which I think is very important to understand, but I want to perform my culture in a way that's intentional and meaningful in that way. And I know, just because I'm Korean American doesn't mean that I reflect all the Asians out there, but because there's like thousands of different cultures, there's 27 countries, and even within each country has so many different type of cultures. But if you look at just how Asian cultures in general and how Asia was formed, it's quite different in terms of the practices of Western culture. Asian culture was not necessarily very imperialistic outside of their territories, so to speak. I mean, sure, there were like China and Mongol that they were like battling each other to create huge dynasties and areas, but they tended to be really regionalized within their area. Whereas in Western culture, you'll see a lot of European history of just trying to take over the whole Western area. In fact, like America was founded on imperialism and the colonization of North America, and just that desire to kind of land and expand is a very Western mindset. Whereas in Asian culture, it was more on like, this is our territory, this is our home, and this is what we're trying to have. And you'll see, like I could see a lot of those different type of areas that are different, as well as I think in other cultures, like in Black culture and Hispanic culture, like those are also similar as I've seen with Asian culture, that we didn't come up with an area that kind of is more about land and expand and conquering. And so with that, I think just seeing, again, there are historical cultures that originate from different areas, and how they reflect in our day-to-day activities is pretty important to see.
One of the ways that I've seen Asian culture and understanding differences in culture has been in our own community here, and families we've gotten to know who are Asian from multiple regions. And so as you were just talking about, different regions of Asia have different tendencies in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. And for us, getting to know these families, walking alongside these families, watching my girls play and be in class with Asian classmates, mm-hmm. a different experience than you had and than I had. Now I merge that together with the work we do in corporate life, mm-hmm. in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And then I trace that all the way back through my life and see, as I look back, the coworkers my dad had in corporate America, mm-hmm. who had come here on short-term visas as contractors working in corporate life. At that point in my life, 20, 30 years ago, I had a very different perspective. It was a different part of the city. It was a different community. My dad didn't work in the neighborhood. And mm-hmm. so those families lived, ironically, in this community where we're sitting right now, where I'm living now as an adult, raising my kids. But I was on the other side of the city in a very different kind of community. So now, as I look back and see, okay, it's the Asians today who aren't just contractors, but are full-time employees, permanent residents here in the States, are now working for the very same company my dad was working for 20, 30 years ago. Now I'm walking alongside them, and I'm seeing a whole life cycle in myself, reflecting in multiple seasons of my own life. So talk a little bit from your perspective. How has your story, your experience shifted as you moved from childhood through school into your career, and now at this point where you are in your career?
Yeah, I think a big part of that has been navigating through those, like what I said earlier, the unconscious behaviors that I was doing, because I don't think I really had anyone competent to help me navigate that journey, so to speak. And so, like, for example, like I remember growing up as a kid, there were a lot of things that I was not Korean enough. Like, my parents would often say, like, that's not what Koreans do. Because I'm picking up a lot of behaviors that my friends were doing from school. And I don't know, like, I didn't grow up in Korea. I don't know what Koreans do. But I would get a lot of critique and say, like, that's not what Koreans do. We don't do it that way. Like, that, you're supposed to do it this way. I'm like, okay. So you're kind of learning through critique, which is not always the best way because you're told what not to do, but you don't know what to do. But then I go to school and I felt like, well, I'm not Chinese or Japanese, which were the only two other Asians that were there in my school. And on the other side of things, like, I just didn't fit in because I didn't know a lot of things that the kids were doing that their parents were doing, like playing games like hopscotch. I didn't know how to play hopscotch, like who stole the cookie from the cookie jar. I remember seeing that, but I didn't know what I was doing. I'm just mimicking along. And a lot of times I felt like I was ostracized in a lot of ways. And so I didn't feel like I was American. And my whole childhood journey was this ability to learn who I am. There was that term, like, I'm Korean American, so I'm a mix of two. But then even that is not something you could put your finger on and say, like, oh, this is what a Korean American is supposed to be. I just had these elements that my parents were telling me to be like, which they only knew how to be Korean. And then 8 hours a day I'm spending at school trying to be like everybody else, which was deemed as American. But I remember in elementary school, like a lot of my day-to-day life was getting beat up at school because I don't think other people knew who I was either. Mm-hmm. And I think because I was awkward, I was different, I was vulnerable, I think there were a lot of people that took advantage of that in a way. I did have some good friends, and I think they were the allies in my life that were willing to understand. They didn't make fun of me. They thought a lot of things that were different were kind of cool. And I remember they would come to my house and we would hang out a lot. But I think in junior high school was when a lot of that started to maybe not get more clear in terms of what that identity looked like, but there were a lot more Asians. Like the change between the early 80s to the mid 80s, where I was growing up, which was in West Los Angeles, shifted dramatically. Part of it was also like you have the different elementary schools got together. I think there were about 5 or 6 elementary schools that got together. And in middle school, there were like all these other Asians. So it was kind of cool. It's like, oh, wow, there's more people like me. And so that was kind of fun to say, like, I don't have to be like anybody else. I could just be me because there are other people that are like me. And they understood some of those mannerisms. They understood like why we take our shoes off when we come to our house. And I would go to their house and we would be able to do those things. And so in those areas that were unconsciously incompetent, those that we were doing bad, it was great to like be able to practice some unconscious competency. Like, hey, I could just be myself and I could feel normal and not have to live in this type of a high anxiety type of a culture around me because I was always just trying to fit in. I didn't fit in. And then I remember in high school, things shifted even more because I think in the early 90s, There was a huge immigration wave that kind of proceeded, and people started finding out where they wanted to live. And I think West LA at the time was an area that more Asians came in. But I found what was, in retrospect, what I thought was interesting was because I had finally found my friends, not just Asian, that were like grew up in America their whole lives, kind of like me. But I had a lot of non-Asian friends that I was really close to as well. And I went to a school that was very multicultural in a way. And I would say probably it was like about 10% Asian, 20% Hispanic, 20% Black, and about 50% white. I'm just spitballing numbers, but I think that's what the demographics look like. And of the Asian crowd, though, it was a lot of recent immigrants where they spoke their native Asian language as much as they spoke English at the time. And so I didn't identify with them, which was kind of interesting, right? Because I didn't identify with those that were like non-Asian, and I identify with those that were like probably the more, I would say, more pure Asian in terms of the culture and how they lived. I was right there in the middle as well. And what I found was that, like, in my attempts to kind of go back and forth, like what my identity was, I realized then that I am very Korean American. I am equal parts Korean as equal part American. But I was picking and choosing what part I wanted to do based on what was comfortable to me. And I don't think I was still doing it intentionally at all. And it wasn't until like college where there are, again, more Asians kind of helping you to kind of feel more comfortable on both extremes of that paradigm. And then going into the workforce where I think there's a lot more standardization that starts to happen a little bit. And because I worked for a large telecom company that was very institutionalized, I was probably, again, it kind of threw me back to my old days of elementary school where I was, again, back to like the one or two Asian in the whole office, maybe. It was very challenging for me again. And I think I felt more consciously as an adult, I relived a lot of those struggles that I had. And it wasn't until probably later in my career, probably about 10 years in, that I realized in order for me to do this well, I had to do this more intentionally. Like I couldn't just pick and choose what part of my culture or my experiences that I want to have. Because one, people saw me as just being Asian and they didn't know what part of that paradigm or that spectrum that I was living in. And so I had to be more intentional in how I showed up and be more deliberate to let them know that, I am an Asian that can fully speak English very well, lived here my whole life, and I am very apt in doing the work that you want me to do. But I also realized the way that I grew up taught me to interact with people at work differently than how a lot of my Western friends did. And some of the things that they would do that I felt like I was taught not to do. And so I had to learn those ways and start becoming uncomfortable in the areas that were challenging me. But by deliberately growing and seeing what I had to do differently, I started to understand those were the challenges that most other Asians also felt as well. That the cultural paradigms of how Asian culture tends to similarly have a hard time challenging maybe a hierarchical structures, not being able to chit chat with the bosses, having water cooler talk. Those are challenges that a lot of Asians face, and they still tend to face that today because culturally we don't do that with other people. And so I reflect back, rewinding the tape from back to like my early childhood of when I was 3, some of the earliest memories of where these conflicts started to occur. And then how even today now I'm trying to manage some of those things that tend to pop up even now, but trying to help others that may not be able to see these blind spots that occur so they can navigate them more intentionally and feel like they could be their true selves as well as achieve the goals that they're trying to have.
One of the words we use a lot is intentional. And there's something about being intentional and shifting from that unconscious and making our actions conscious. That for me growing up, no one ever needed to ask me. I didn't have to think about it. I just was in every community, in every setting, school, church. When I started working, playing Little League, I just was. I didn't have to think about which way I was acting, or which way I was communicating, which way I was responding. And truly, when we think about it, and we use the language with our clients nowadays, that we want you to be intentional about how you communicate. And how we grew up, the community, the culture we grew up from, surrounded by, is just a part of that. We also have some natural wiring that plays into that. But I don't think it was until you and I started having conversations that the way you would highlight certain dynamics between two people, between leaders within a team and a company we were working with. It wasn't until I started spending time with you and having an opportunity to hear another perspective or ask the question or shine a light on, hey, this is what's really happening under the surface. Have you thought about this before? And I think for me, particularly in building bridges across cultures, it's really important for us to have this conversation so that we can walk people through, here's how to do this in your own life, in your own setting, in your own situation. I don't come as the expert. I just come because I've spent a lot of time with you, and you've invited me on this journey of discovery for myself. And so that's what we want to have in this conversation, in this podcast channel, is a series of episodes talking about unpacking. Let's ask the question. Let's talk about it. Let's reflect on it, both from your story and your experience and some of the challenges, some of the highlights that you've had. And then I can respond and reflect on, well, what was the teacher or the coach or the coworker thinking or feeling or reflecting on? And in doing that, we can begin to build bridges. And hopefully for you who are listening and watching, you can join us in this discussion and this dialogue so that you can participate for yourself. You can begin to see yourself in somewhere in my story or in Jim's story. And our questions will begin to give you a way that you can see yourself in this and that you can take your own next step on this journey of discovery.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. Just to again highlight back, there's a lot of things, being white that you didn't have to think through, and that's okay. I think what's powerful is that when you choose to think through, and I think that's the same way for us as Asians or all minorities in a way, we are the minority voice. And I think it's interesting for us to believe, for us here in America, that we live in a government that is set by the people and our vote and our voice should matter. So if, let's say, we're to, vote on something and the majority wins, then we need to do what the majority wants on that vote. And you might not like it, but that's what the majority rules. And I think likewise, that's how our culture has been. That the power has been given to the majority that tends to make the decision in the way. And so we need to realize that that's the culture we're in. It's part of our government. It's part of how we want. If all the Asians outnumbered the other people and we decided one way, then we would want that. I think that's just a natural part of the culture of our government that we live in. But yet, I think what's more powerful, Aaron, is your choice to say, hey, I have this option, I have this power. But I realize for me to be able to lead effectively and to live intentionally in this community, I have to defer that authority and responsibility that I have so that other people can have ownership. And that's truly what I think is powerful about the communities that we have, is that we can create communities that everybody wants to be a part of and has ownership in, because we understand other people a little bit more. And that even though that most of the people would feel comfortable in just doing things the way we want to do it, that both sides have an opportunity to grow. Both sides have opportunities to empower ourselves to do things a little bit differently and see opportunities that might not have existed only because we engaged in conversations with one another. And that's what I hope we represent in a way. That, even though we do this for a living and we're probably not the foremost experts on this topic, but we've put in our 10,000 hours. I know, Aaron, you've spent way much time, not only just in your own personal life, but in the past year and a half when I've challenged you on this topic to become more of an ally, and the hours that you spent online with me to have these conversations, they exceed those 1,000 hours that most people haven't done. And so, for the audience, that's where we come from. We're not saying we're the best, but we've done this. We've worked intentionally for this. And this podcast wasn't done on a whim. It was something that we've thought through. We've talked. We've encapsulated stories from the past year that we've discussed and compared notes on our lives on. And as fathers ourselves, how are we want to do this and pass this on to the new generation? So I thank you for that. Thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation.
Well, and thanks for inviting me along. So as you think about where our next conversations come, and it won't just be us, we'll have conversations with other leaders of multiple different backgrounds and cultures, not just Asian leaders, but Latino leaders and Black leaders, and from all different stories. What's your hope and your goal for this channel on the podcast?
Yeah, I think in order for us to really, truly be intentional as leaders is we can take a look at the people that might challenge us to do things differently, how in fact they actually make our lives better. And so the more the diversity we have, the more challenges we face, even though at the time may be very uncomfortable. And I understand sometimes some people's foods, some people's mannerisms, they're all challenging. But I don't think that's just an ethnic issue. I know a lot of people that are just Korean that I can't deal with. I know a lot of people that just can't deal with other coworkers that aren't necessarily different ethnicities. But I think sometimes different cultures can help bring out the opportunity for us to become better leaders and help highlight the areas that we have challenges, the things that we can improve upon, so that we can learn to grow and become better leaders of the generations ahead of us, and also empower other people to bring their best to the table as well.
I think my hope is that there are so many stories around us in the world. They don't just fit in nice, neat little boxes. But there is so much more that we can learn, we can discover. And as you said a little while ago, it's not our hope to make us become something we're not. Mm-hmm. But it's simply to build a bridge to understand the stories that are different than ours, understand why those stories might be different. And you mentioned food. Yeah. There are a number of foods that I eat now that I didn't eat growing up. And I am so thankful for that. And so our hope for each of you is that there is some part of your story and some part of someone else's story that you will begin to hear, you will truly understand and seek to learn and know about. That's not a story you would have heard or understood or asked questions about earlier in your career or in your life. So we invite you to join us on this journey. Come along with us, listen to these stories, and in some way begin to share your own story and your experience with the people around you, the people who matter most to you, the people you spend the most time with. Subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcasting platform at newgenerationleader.fm and join us on our next allyship episode. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the New Generation Leader podcast. Subscribe today on your podcasting platform. Download the show notes and unlock your true leadership potential at newgenerationleader.fm. Thanks for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the New Generation Leader podcast.